Hello everybody, I'm Felix Wemheuer and this is my YouTube channel Studying Maoist China. And I'm back in the studio to produce some videos to introduce important topics, and for 20 years I must say I'm interested in this topic, peasant resistance in Maoist China. When we look at official narratives in the Mao era here in a propaganda poster, the party often portrayed the relations of peasants and the CCP as a kind of natural alliance where the large majority of peasants had supported the Chinese Revolution, then only a couple of class enemies had resisted land reform, and finally a collective order was established. And according to the official narrative in the Mao era, the party had to be aware that peasants were small producer because they were also entitled to have small plots for private use, and small production could produce capitalism. However, if the party implemented its policy right and educated backward peasants, the socialist order was not at threat, and most peasants were considered reliable allies of the CCP, and during the Cultural Revolution, urban youths were even sent down to the countryside to learn from the peasantry. However, this image of course changed over time, and in the West and also in China, peasant studies became important, and one of the pioneers of these studies was James C. Scott and his famous Agrarian Studies Center at Yale. And he argued in his books that peasants would often choose forms of resistance you could not immediately see. They call it the weapons of the weak, and one of his books was also called Hidden Transcripts, right, of that resistance. I will explain later to you what does this mean. And of course, China studies were also influenced by peasant studies. James Scott's works also have been translated in Chinese, but for the Western research, I think this book is very important, from Ralph Sexton, Catastrophe and Contention in Rural China, where he mainly built on oral history to learn about the weapons of the weak and hidden forms of resistance of the Chinese peasants. I wrote my dissertation about the greatly famine forward in Henan, and I did also interviews in villages and also asked peasants how could they survive the famine. In the beginning, I want to make some brief comments why a lot of peasants would try to resist the collective order of agriculture. If you are interested in more details, I also have a video on the impact of the Soviet model where I explain this graph in more detail. To keep it short, China in the 1950s copied the economic system of the Soviet Union that was designed to squeeze out resources from the countryside to develop a heavy industry. And you can see here in this graph that the state established a monopoly for the sale and purchase of grain, including all important foodstuff from the countryside, and the state would set this purchase prices very low, and then the urban population was entitled to receive grain rations and was fed by the state, where the rural population was classified as self-reliant. And the state purchased the so-called surplus, sometimes more, to feed the city, but also to export grain in the Soviet Union and to other socialist states in order to import industrial goods. And this model was enforced more or less until it resulted in a famine and a collapse, and then China had to import grain. In this system, rural citizens were only second-class citizens. The state established mainly a purely urban welfare state, and here you can see a ration card that was only issued in the cities. So against this background that this order was designed to squeeze the peasantry for industrial development, it faced immediately resistance when it was established. And in the beginning, most scholars, they did oral history interviews, but now we also have many archival documents, and here I present also the Chinese terms, and you can use the databases edited by Sung Yong Yi from the 1950s and 60s to fill in these terms, and you will also find many official documents and reports of that. Of course, by that time, most of the reports were kept secret. So when collectivization was enforced in the beginning, peasants had the right to retreat from the collectives, and in some provinces they used this right to agree that the collectivization movement would collapse. And then by 57, I think the government made clear that this was considered a form of anti-socialist behavior and was crushed. During the process of the introduction of the agriculture cooperatives, but also the introduction of the People's Commune, in many places we could then see massive slaughter of cattle. And after the communes were established, there was no way to retreat anymore, but there were kind of new forms of resistance inside the communes. For example, of stealing or borrowing grain from the collective and not returning it. Ralph Saxon and others have shown that during the famine, peasants started to eat green. This meant they went into the fields and ate unripe maize or wheat, right, to fill their stomachs before the state would take parts of the harvest. Very widespread in the 1950s, but also then in the area of the People's Communes, was concealing production and private distribution. A production team that was the lowest unity in the People's Commune, they would sometimes work together, underreport production in order to keep more. Production teams or other individuals also set up black grain stocks. Black means so it's illegal. They underreported land because, right, the estimate of land was then related to the production targets, or they also would try to hide like black land. In the 1950s, 60s and 70s there were also reports that black markets developed, and inside the People's Commune, then after the famine, starting from 61, peasants had the right to get small plots for private use, that they could grow vegetables to feed themselves, and the state wanted to limit this land like to 5 or 6%, but often then local actors they try to illegally expand these plots for private use. The era of the People's Commune also, of course, saw the problem of bad work disciplines. Idling on the job is called Moyanggung. There were many ways to Moyanggung, just asked maybe elderly Chinese from the countryside. And in my own research on the 1950s and early 1960s, also I also have argued that peasants were accused by the state that they would exaggerate damage by natural disaster to demand relief, or that they would falsely report as non-surplus households. So in every village there were the three categories: surplus household, self-sufficient household, and non-surplus household, and you try to manipulate the system in order to report as a non-surplus household that you were not forced to deliver much. In 57, 58, also the party press accused peasants that would fake hunger in order to demand relief. And when the famine started, of course, many people tried to escape and get some jobs in cities or in the industries. And in times of crisis, at least in some parts of China, also local caterers and peasants secretly introduced family farming. For example, 56, 61, and then later in the 1970s called Baochandao Hu, or in Anhui province, Zhejiang. a major question that have been debated in the research is what should count as resistance. Of course, there were different perceptions by peasants or by state actors. A person who ate green because was hungry would not necessarily think that this act would be kind of a resistance against the state. So the Chinese scholar Gao Wangling, he introduced the term counteractions, Fanxing Wei, as survival strategy and responses to state policies without the intent to rebel. However, Gao argued if thousands would practice, for example, stealing or eating green, it would harm, right, the grain collection of the state. And Gao was, I think, one of the most important pioneers in these studies. He unfortunately already died. He was jilting to the Cultural Revolution, where he got more familiar with the countryside, then went back to these villages for oral history interviews, but he also collected many documents, so I warmly recommend this book published in Hong Kong, Zhongguo Nongming Fanxing Wei Yanjiu. So Gao argued that we should consider these actions more counteraction and not resistance, while Ralph Saxon, for example, labeled eating green as an anti-state resistance that contributed to the end of the famine. Shen Yixin, who is also a scholar of Chinese peasants, and his book, I think, will also soon be published by Cornell University Press, he argues that eating green would be no resistance at all, because after peasants had ate green, the state would take its share of the harvest anyway. Ralph Dikötter also published a book on a famine, and he argued against the glorification of resistance, because especially during the famine, these forms of stealing often would then hurt the weaker parts of the collectives and not the state, like in almost every famine. Also during the Chinese famine, there's people starved to death first, where sick people, weak people, children, elderly people, and so on. Jean Oy, she wrote her book about the peasant-state relation in the later stage, so in the early 1970s, in the People's Commune, and she argued that there was a kind of silent agreement between the state and the peasantry regarding underreporting, so as long as the local actors would not overdo this underreporting, higher authorities would turn a blind eye to it. And James Scott also made an interesting argument in the context of high modernist states and also Soviet agriculture, that these systems would often not work when there is kind of no resistance. For example, also the People's Commune in the beginning was designed that the peasants would be fed by the People's Commune, and they do not need any private plots or any private stocks, because the collective would take responsibility. But after millions died, it was clear for the state and the peasantry that this would not work. So in the People's Commune, these private plots were reintroduced, that peasants at least could feed themselves, because the collective or the state could not do it. And this finally made the system work more or less for then the next decade. Yeah, after this more general introduction to peasant resistance, I want to now show you a case study. I have recently written an article together with a Chinese colleague, and we could use court files from the county level, from Shandong province, from the 1950s, and we were looking at several crimes, and then we were focusing on crimes that were related to peasant resistance. We do not know how peasants thought about these actions, but the state would see these actions as resistance and as criminal. So in the last part of this presentation, so I want to introduce these 3 crimes or forms of resistance to you. Daoswan, illegal resizing, disturbing of markets or speculation, later also called Hoji Daoba, and Porchai sabotage. So resizing meant that during the land reform, the state had handed out land to poor and lower middle peasants, and then landlords would try to resize this land or resize trees and houses. In the beginning, the law for the land reform for 1950s only named the crime of landlord resizing, Dijo Dauswan, but later this crime was expanded, or this level also to rich peasants, right? And this was somehow a ex post punishment, but because in the beginning, right, this paragraph was only targeted against landlords. So we have many court fights and convictions, and when the rich peasants then are convicted in the mid-1950s, in the late 1950s for the resizing of property from the land reform or collective property. Speculation and disturbance of the market. In the beginning, this label was only targeted at urban traders and middlemen, also before the state monopoly for grain purchase and sale was introduced. However, like we have hundreds of files that also show then that then later in the mid-1950s, in late 1950s, also poor peasants and middle peasants were punished for speculation or disturbing the market, and the major activities were black market activities and fraud of purchase and grain and resistance against grain taxes, and sometimes also officials who were in charge of the grain stocks were then accused that they had used some of these stocks to sell it on a private market. So the major convicts here were not landlords or class enemies, but poor middle peasants or kinds of peasants who were accused to resist the enforcing of the state monopoly for purchase and sale of grain. Tonggo, Tongxiao auf Chinesisch, in Chinese. And the crime sabotage was more widely used, and more ambiguous. So in the verdicts of the courts, we found crimes such as damage of collected property, illegal slaughtering of cattle, food theft, spreading of rumors, rightist critique of collectivization, so somebody said something bad about the People's Commune, or damage of a soldier's marriage. And the convicts also had all kind of class status. Especially in 1958, many convicts were middle peasants, and during the famine, also poor peasants were punished for sabotage. For example, when they would illegal slaughter cattle, or if they would steal food, right? According to the official line of the CCP, like landlords and rich peasants are the bad guys. Middle peasants should be like allies if you treat them rightly, and the good parts of the population would be poor and lower middle peasants. But here we can also see that like people with good class status became the targets of the courts. So to summarize the findings, so court punishments of crimes such as resizing, speculation and sabotage were regularly very harsh, including several years in prison. And this was very interesting for me. Doing my oral history interviews, people reported like informal form of punishment. So somebody had stole food, then maybe the caterers would mobilize some people for a struggle meeting, and people were beaten up and were tortured. I think in the countryside of Grönland in the 1950s that was very common, but people did not tell me about legal punishments by courts. At least in this case of Shandong, we can prove that these legal punishments by courts were kind of very important and harsh. Like for stealing a chicken, you could get several years in prison. Also, during the Great Leap Forward, this place saw a massive increase of criminal cases. This might be linked to the policies to introduce a mass dictatorship by that point of time that deformalized the normal legal procedures and targeted more people and also made punishments more easy. So criminal justice played an important role to enforce the state monopoly for grain trade and the socialist order, and also harsh punishments were used to establish control over resources such as land, houses, a tree or livestock. And many forms of petty trade maybe were everyday practices by peasants before the collectivization, but now the state labeled it as resistance and criminalized these forms of actions. Yeah, we do not know what peasants thought at that time, but we can understand and study the rationale of local courts and state actors, why and how they would crack down on peasant resistance. So, thanks a lot and have a good day. Bye bye.